Interstellar diplomacy, as it turned out, required three things: impeccable timing, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to pretend you weren't about to witness a complete meltdown of centuries-old protocol. The Kashari Luminance, a vessel that made most planetary palaces look like budget motels, hung in the new. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Neutral zone between four territories like a very expensive, very judgmental chandelier. Its corridors gleamed with bioluminescent panels that cost more than some planets' GDP. And every surface whispered of civilizations that had mastered faster-than-light travel before humans figured out bronze. Ambassador Vektharan of the Velrathi sovereignty stood near the observation deck's primary window, his forearms crossed in a configuration that his aides recognized as catastrophically stressed but trying not to show it. His crystalline carapace reflected the starlight in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't currently pulsing in the Velrathi equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Behind him, his mate, consort Shimara, maintained the serene posture expected of Velrathi royalty, which was impressive considering their two offspring were currently treating the diplomatic reception like a particularly elaborate playground. The cubs, Ren and Mika, possessed all the dignity of their station and approximately none of the attention span. At roughly 40 solar cycles old, they'd reached that special age where they understood enough to be dangerous, but not enough to care about consequences. They skittered between the legs of various dignitaries, their smaller crystalline forms catching light like mobile prisms, leaving a trail of bemused Thandorians and mildly horrified Kickstar in their wake. "They will behave," Shimara said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested this was more prayer than statement. "The human arrives soon. They will be curious, yes, but they will behave." Vektharan's carapace flickered in a pattern that roughly translated to, "I'll believe it when I see it," but he said nothing. The human. Everything came down to the human now, which would have been hilarious if it weren't so terrifying. 300 cycles of careful negotiation, 12 species, one disputed weapons technology, and their best hope was the representative from a species that had only figured out FTL 30 solar cycles ago by apparently duct taping an antimatter reactor to what was essentially a glorified cargo hauler and hoping for the best. The species that, according to reports, thought safety protocols were suggestions rather than laws. The species that had somehow, impossibly, become the swing vote in the most important treaty negotiation in recent galactic history. The door chimed, and every being in the reception hall turned with the kind of synchronized attention usually reserved for natural disasters or particularly spectacular supernovas. The human entered with the casual confidence of someone who either didn't understand the gravity of the situation or understood it perfectly and had decided not to care. Envoy Jackson, the humans called this one. Tall by human standards, which meant average by most galactic species measurements, with skin the color of Thandorian sunset sands and hair cropped close in a style that seemed designed for efficiency rather than aesthetics. The human wore their diplomatic uniform, a dark ensemble that managed to look both formal and somehow ready for immediate evacuation, which probably said something profound about human psychology that nobody wanted to examine too closely. "Ambassador Vektharan," the human said, approaching with hand extended in that peculiar human greeting gesture that had confused xenobiologists for years. "Consort Shimara, thank you for hosting this discussion." The human's Velrathi was textbook perfect, which made the slight accent even more noticeable. Humans had a way of speaking other languages that suggested they were surprised their mouths could make the sounds at all, but were determined to make it work through sheer stubbornness. "Envoy Jackson," Vektharan replied, his vocal harmonics smoothing into diplomatic registers. "We are honored by your presence. The others are assembling in the—" He didn't get to finish. Ren, demonstrating the perfect timing that cubs across the galaxy seem to possess for maximum disruption, chose that exact moment to discover the human. The young Velrathi froze mid-scamper, crystalline eyes widening to approximately twice their normal size. A beat later, Mika crashed into Ren's back with the grace of a meteor strike, and both cubs tumbled toward the human in a tangle of limbs and high-pitched chirping that made every adult Velrathi in the room flinch. "Soft! Soft alien! Parent! The human is here!" This was not, strictly speaking, how first contact with human representatives was supposed to proceed. Vektharan's carapace flashed through several colors that didn't have polite translations. Shimara moved forward with the speed of a parent who'd spent 40 cycles preventing exactly this kind of incident. But the human was already crouching down, bringing themselves to the cub's eye level. "Hey there," Jackson said, and the tone was softer than any voice the human had used in previous transmissions. "You must be Ren and Mika. Your parents mentioned you might be here." The cubs circled the human with the wariness of small predators encountering something new and potentially fascinating. Ren reached out one crystalline appendage and poked the human's sleeve. "Why are you soft? Everyone else is hard or scaly or—" A pause while Ren searched for the right word. "Squishy wrong. You are squishy right." "Evolutionary adaptation," Jackson replied with the kind of straight-faced seriousness usually reserved for treaty negotiations. "My species decided that internal skeletons were the way to go. Made us easier to hug. What is hug? And because the universe clearly had a sense of humor that leaned toward the absurd. The human demonstrated by gently wrapping arms around both cubs in a gesture that made every Velrathi in the room freeze in collective horror. Physical contact with offspring. You weren't related to ranked somewhere between galactic incident and cause for blood feud in Velrathi culture. The cubs chirped in delight, their carapaces brightening to shades that indicated pure joy. Vektharan felt something in his thorax clench. Either his secondary heart or his political career. Possibly both. "I apologize, Envoy," he began, his harmonics tight with mortification. "They are young. They do not understand." "They're fine," Jackson said, releasing the cubs and standing. Curious kids are the same everywhere, apparently. Even several thousand light-years from Earth. The human's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. "Should we head to the conference chamber? I understand we have a weapons treaty to argue about for the next 6 hours. 6 hours. 6 hours of technical specifications, legal frameworks, enforcement protocols, and the kind of carefully worded diplomatic language that could mean 3 different things, depending on which set of vocal harmonics you emphasized. 6 hours during which the fate of several contested star systems hung in the balance because someone had developed a gravitational weapon that technically didn't violate any existing treaties, but absolutely violated the spirit of approximately all of them. 6 hours with 2 energetic cubs who had just discovered their new favorite alien. The conference chamber was exactly what you'd expect from a vessel designed to host the galaxy's most powerful beings. Vast, intimidating, and probably more expensive than a small moon. The central table was a work of art, formed from a single piece of Kickstar resonance crystal that caught and held light in ways that seemed to violate at least 3 physical laws. Seats arranged in a perfect circle, because hierarchy was, theoretically, checked at the door. Each position had holographic display capabilities, translation matrices, and enough computing power to run a planetary defense grid. Representatives from 12 species settled into their positions with the careful posturing of beings who'd spent decades learning to read each other's threat displays. The Thandorian delegation took their seats with perfect synchronization, their scales shimmering in unified patterns. The Kickstar floated in their atmospheric containment fields, gas clouds swirling in what might have been anticipation, or might have been their equivalent of deep breathing exercises. The Cathek representative coiled their serpentine body with mathematical precision, and the human sat down with the casual posture of someone settling in to watch a midly interesting sporting event. Datapad already out, fingers moving across its surface with the kind of easy confidence that came from a species that had built their entire technological revolution on the idea that if you pressed enough buttons in the right order, eventually something would work. Vektharan took his position at the head of the arrangement, his consort beside him. The cubs, who had been promised an educational opportunity to observe important galactic proceedings, sat in smaller seats designed specifically for them. Their attention lasted approximately 40 seconds before they started fidgeting. "Honored delegates," Vektharan began, his harmonics pitched for maximum diplomatic gravitas. "We convene to address the matter of Classification 7 weapons development, specifically gravitational manipulation devices, as deployed in the Helix Sector incident of Cycle 4720. The Sovereignty proposes restrictions that would cripple legitimate defense capabilities," the Thandorian primary ambassador interrupted, her scales shifting to aggressive amber, while ignoring their own research into quantum displacement technology, which is entirely different from gravitational, different in name only, and they were off, launching into the kind of circular argument that had been going on for 12 cycles, with no resolution in sight. The human, Jackson, listened with an expression of polite attention, occasionally making notes, asking clarifying questions with the precision of someone who'd actually read all 40,000 pages of background documentation. The cubs lasted another 3 minutes before Ren leaned over to Mika and whispered, loudly enough for half the chamber to hear, "This is boring. When does the interesting part happen?" "There is no interesting part," Mika whispered back. "Parents said this is important adult talking." "Important adult talking is just boring talking, but longer." Several delegates' expressions suggested they agreed with this assessment, but were too professional to say so. The human's mouth twitched in what might have been suppressed laughter. 3 hours in, with positions entrenched and tempers fraying around the edges of diplomatic language, Jackson finally spoke up. "If I may suggest a framework that addresses both concerns about defensive capability and proliferation risk." The chamber fell silent. The human tapped the datapad, and holographic displays materialized above the center table, showing technical specifications that made the Kickstar delegation's containment fields ripple with interest. And that's when Jackson stood, moving to the display to better illustrate the proposal's finer points, gesturing to various elements with the kind of animated explanation style that suggested humans really liked to talk with their hands when they got excited about something. The thing about technical explanations, Jackson was discovering, was that they had a very specific effect on young Velrathi cubs. Somewhere between explaining quantum entanglement principles and gravitational field manipulation, Ren's crystalline eyes began to dim, slightly. Not from boredom, exactly. More like the biological imperative of a juvenile brain deciding that complex physics discussions ranked somewhere below nap time on the priority list. Mika noticed first, nudging the sibling with one small appendage. But Jackson's voice had taken on that particular cadence humans seemed to naturally fall into when explaining things they found genuinely fascinating. Steady, methodical, occasionally punctuated with hand gestures that traced imaginary particle trajectories through the air. Ren's head dipped, corrected, dipped again. Vektharan saw it happening and felt his secondary heart skip exactly 3 beats. This was fine. The cub was simply resting eyes. Velrathi Young did this. Perfectly normal behavior that would resolve itself momentarily, and definitely would not result in a catastrophic breach of diplomatic protocol during the most important treaty negotiation in recent history. The human continued, oblivious, explaining how theoretical containment fields could limit effective range without compromising defensive capability. One hand gestured toward the holographic display. The other, and this was where things started sliding sideways into disaster territory, rested casually on the edge of the table, right where Ren had been leaning. The cub's head made contact with the human's shoulder with all the ceremony of a small meteor finding a convenient landing site. The soft fabric of Jackson's uniform apparently qualified as the most comfortable surface Ren had encountered in 40 solar cycles of existence. A small, contented chirp escaped the cub's vocal harmonics. Jackson paused mid-sentence, looked down, looked at Vekatharan with an expression that somehow managed to convey both "I see the situation" and "I'm going to pretend this is fine" simultaneously. Then continued explaining gravitational weapon specifications without missing a beat, just with slightly more restricted arm movements and a juvenile Velrathi using the human's shoulder as a pillow. Mika watched this development with the calculating intelligence of a sibling recognizing an opportunity. If Ren got to sleep on the soft alien, why shouldn't Mika? The second cub maneuvered with the stealth of someone who'd spent their entire short life perfecting the art of getting into situations parents specifically said not to get into. The human's other shoulder acquired a passenger. 12 species worth of diplomatic representatives stared in collective horror. The Cathek delegate's serpentine body actually formed a question mark shape. One of the Kickstar's gas clouds briefly destabilized before reconstituting. Jackson adjusted posture slightly to better support the additional weight and kept talking about enforcement protocols like this was completely normal. Shimara's carapace had cycled through approximately 17 different color patterns in the last 4 minutes, none of them associated with positive emotional states. Velrathi cultural. Protocols regarding offspring were complex, ancient, and absolutely inflexible on one particular point. You did not, under any circumstances, disturb a sleeping cub unless the ship was actively exploding. Even then, you were expected to consider your options carefully. The fact that said cubs were currently draped across an alien diplomat like particularly awkward scarves during the most critical treaty discussion in recent memory did not technically create an exception to this rule. Protocol was protocol, even when protocol was actively sabotaging galactic peace. Jackson shifted slightly, redistributing weight with the unconscious competence of someone who'd apparently done this before, which raised questions about human social structures that nobody had time to contemplate, because the envoy was now pulling up additional data streams with one hand, while the other remained carefully still to avoid disturbing Mika's position. "The enforcement mechanism I'm proposing," Jackson continued, voice dropping to a lower volume that somehow carried better than before, "creates a 3-tier verification system. Primary inspection rights rotate quarterly between signatory species. Secondary authorization requires consensus from at least 7 of the 12 represented governments. Tertiary oversight remains with the Kashari Arbitration Council." The Thandorian ambassador leaned forward, scales shifting to interested copper. "And if a signatory refuses inspection access? Then they forfeit technology sharing privileges and face economic sanctions calibrated to the severity of non-compliance." Jackson manipulated the holographic display with impressive dexterity, considering the mobility constraints. But here's the part that addresses your earlier concern about defensive capability restrictions. A new schematic bloomed in the air above the crystal table. Ren made a small sleeping sound that translated roughly to contentment. Jackson didn't even flinch, just adjusted shoulder angle by approximately 3 degrees and kept going. "We're not limiting the technology itself. We're limiting deployment contexts and requiring transparent documentation of research applications. You can develop gravitational manipulation for defensive purposes. You just can't disguise offensive weapons as defensive systems and expect nobody to notice." The Cathek representative uncoiled slightly, which was their equivalent of intrigued agreement. "This framework would apply to all Classification 7 technologies, including quantum displacement?" "Including quantum displacement," Jackson confirmed, "and neural disruption fields, dimensional shearing devices, and that thing the Kickstar have been developing that nobody wants to talk about, but everyone knows exists. Several of the Kickstar delegation's gas clouds swirled in what might have been embarrassment, might have been indignation. Gas cloud emotions were notoriously difficult to read, which was probably why they were so good at galactic poker. Vectharan felt something shift in the chamber's atmosphere. Not literally, though the Kickstar could probably manage that if sufficiently motivated. But the tenor of discussion was changing, moving from entrenched positions toward something that looked dangerously close to actual negotiation. And through it all, the humans stood there with two sleeping cubs on their shoulders, pulling up technical specifications, answering questions with the kind of patient detail that suggested they'd anticipated every possible objection, and somehow making it all look like this was just another standard diplomatic session instead of the most absurd situation any of them had witnessed in their professional careers. Mika shifted slightly, crystalline form catching the light. Jackson's hand moved automatically to steady the cub, then returned to navigating the datapad interface without pause. Now, regarding inspection timelines and appeal processes, the human continued, as if conducting high-stakes interstellar diplomacy while serving as impromptu furniture for alien children was just part of the job description. I propose a 40-cycle window for initial compliance, with expedited appeals available for emergency defensive situations. The Thandorian ambassador's scales rippled. Define emergency defensive situations. Jackson grinned, an expression that showed far too many teeth to be entirely diplomatic. I thought you'd ask that. 2 hours later, the treaty framework had taken shape with the kind of momentum that usually required either divine intervention or catastrophic external threat. Neither had materialized. Just one human, 2 sleeping cubs, and an increasingly surreal negotiation process that would probably be analyzed by diplomatic academies for the next 3 centuries. Jackson had moved through objections with surgical precision, addressing concerns about sovereignty, technological advantage, and enforcement overreach, while maintaining the exact posture required to keep both cubs comfortably positioned. At some point, the Kickstar delegation had stopped swirling anxiously and started contributing actual substantive proposals. The Thandorians had dropped their aggressive amber coloring for something closer to collaborative bronze. Even the Kathek representative had uncoiled completely, which was their version of being fully invested in discussion outcomes. Vectharan watched it all unfold, with the growing suspicion that he was witnessing something that shouldn't work, but somehow did anyway. Humans had that effect, apparently. They showed up with their internal skeletons and their alarming tendency to improvise solutions to problems that required careful planning, and somehow the galaxy just rearranged itself around their chaos. Final point, Jackson said, voice still maintaining that careful volume that kept the cubs sleeping. Verification teams must include at least one representative from a non-signatory neutral species. Prevents any appearance of factional bias, and gives smaller civilizations stake in enforcement processes. The Thandorian ambassador tilted her head, scales contemplative. Which neutral species did you have in mind? The Veshtari Collective has expressed interest in observer status for years. They're technologically sophisticated, politically unaligned, and their homeworld is positioned almost perfectly equidistant from all disputed territories. Jackson pulled up a star chart with the hand that wasn't supporting Mika. Plus, their biology makes them effectively immune to most weapon systems we're discussing, which removes any conflict of interest regarding defensive applications. There was a moment of silence while 12 species processed this suggestion and realized they couldn't find anything wrong with it. The Veshtari were notoriously neutral to the point of being boring about it. They'd probably agree to verification duties just because it gave them something interesting to do. I could support this framework, the Kathek representative said slowly, each word carrying weight. Coming from a species that rarely committed to anything faster than geological timescales, this was practically enthusiastic endorsement. The Kickstar delegation swirled in patterns that translated to agreement. The Thandorians exchanged glances, scales shimmering with what looked like consensus building. And that's when Ren woke up. The cub's eyes brightened gradually, coming back online with the confused awareness of someone who'd fallen asleep in one context and woken in another. Small head lifted from Jackson's shoulder, looked around the conference chamber, processed the fact that all these important adults were staring. "Did I miss the interesting part?" Ren asked, voice carrying that particular tone of childhood disappointment. "You missed several interesting parts," Jackson replied, grinning. "But you woke up just in time for the best part." Mika stirred at the sound of voices, crystalline form stretching in a movement that looked like a yawn but probably wasn't, since Velrathi didn't have mouths in the traditional sense. "What is best part?" "The part where everyone agrees," the human said, looking around the chamber with an expression that was partly hopeful and partly challenging. "Right? And because the universe apparently ran on narrative causality and dramatic timing, that's exactly what happened." The Thandorian ambassador's scales settled into agreement gold. The Kickstar swirled affirmatively. The Kathek representative coiled in the configuration that meant acceptance. One by one, 12 species indicated their support for a treaty framework that had seemed impossible 6 hours ago. Vektharan felt his carapace flush with colors he didn't have names for. Relief, certainly. Amazement, definitely. And something else that might have been the dawning realization that his offspring had just accidentally participated in one of the most significant diplomatic achievements in recent galactic history by falling asleep on the right alien at the right time. "The Velrathi sovereignty agrees," he said formally, harmonics pitched for maximum sincerity. "We will begin drafting formal documentation immediately." Jackson carefully extracted themselves from cub-supporting duty as Ren and Mika scrambled down with the energy of young beings who'd just had excellent naps and were ready to cause new chaos. The humans stretched, vertebrae making small popping sounds that caused several delegates to flinch. "I'll have my team coordinate with yours on specific language," Jackson said to Vektharan. "Though I think we've got the framework solid enough that the details shouldn't cause too many problems." Shimara approached, her carapace displaying gratitude colors. "Envoy Jackson, I must apologize for my offspring's behavior. They disrupted your presentation." "They really didn't," the human replied, and the tone was genuine. "Honestly, I think they helped. Hard to maintain aggressive negotiating positions when there are sleeping kids in the room. Makes everyone remember what we're actually trying to protect." Which was either profound wisdom or complete nonsense, and probably both simultaneously. The delegates began filing out, already forming small groups to discuss implementation details. The cubs bounced around Jackson's feet, asking questions about human homeworlds and whether all humans were this soft, and could they visit Earth sometime, because it sounded much more interesting than boring diplomatic conferences. Vektharan watched his offspring pepper the human with queries and felt something in his thorax unclench. The treaty would be signed, the weapons would be regulated, and his cubs had somehow, impossibly, become the galaxy's most effective diplomatic tools without even trying. "They like you," he said to Jackson quietly. "Velrathi young are typically wary of unfamiliar species." "Kids are kids," the human replied with a shrug. "Doesn't matter if they're from Earth or halfway across the galaxy. They just want to know you're not going to hurt them and that you think they're interesting." A pause. "Plus, apparently I make a decent pillow." Later, in reports and official documentation, the breakthrough would be attributed to innovative framework design and collaborative problem-solving. The sleeping cubs wouldn't even get a footnote in the historical record. But everyone in that chamber knew the truth. Sometimes the galaxy didn't need aggressive negotiation or elaborate diplomatic maneuvering. Sometimes it just needed one human who could explain quantum physics while serving as naptime furniture, and somehow make that work in favor of galactic peace. Humans, the other species were learning, had this peculiar talent for taking situations that should be disasters and turning them into something functional through sheer refusal to acknowledge that what they were doing was impossible. The cubs fell asleep on the human's shoulder mid-lecture, and nobody dared wake them. And because nobody woke them, the galaxy got a weapons treaty. 3 weeks later, when the formal signing ceremony took place aboard a different vessel, with significantly more gravitas and significantly fewer napping children, Ren and Mika insisted on attending. They sat perfectly still throughout the entire proceeding, displaying the kind of impeccable behavior that made Vectharan wonder if he'd somehow acquired different offspring. Jackson caught his eye across the ceremonial chamber and winked, a gesture that didn't translate to any known Velrathi expression, but somehow communicated, "Kids behave better when they've already gotten the chaos out of their system." The treaty documentation included provisions for verification, enforcement, appeal processes, and technological transparency. It did not include any mention of impromptu nap time or the fact that the entire framework had been negotiated around sleeping cubs. Some things didn't need to be in official records to be true. As Jackson affixed the human signature to the treaty, using one of those archaic ink-based writing implements that their species inexplicably still preferred, Mika leaned over to whisper to Ren. "The human made boring talking interesting." "No," Ren whispered back. "The human made boring talking sleepy. We made it interesting." Which really said everything you needed to know about humans and their place in the cosmic order. Accidentally effective, completely unconventional, and somehow exactly what everyone needed even when nobody realized it, even if the cubs had their own version of events.